Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So I've received the message from subscribers lately asking me whether there isn't a way to do specific operations in Linux within the GUI. And the answer is yes, there is always a way to do it within the GUI, but one of my reasons for always trying to present the command line interface for particular commands is that the command line tends to break things down into steps and explain how they're operating and exactly what they do. Now, from time to time, yes, I'll also present the GUI interface, but it's really helpful just to provide that interface for the command line and the individual commands. So today we're going to talk a little bit about virtual disk images for both Windows and Ubuntu. So when we think of virtual disk images, we think of the files that have a file type of .vhd or .vhdx, which are version 1 and version 2 of virtual machine disk image files. That is, when you create a virtual machine, you normally create a disk, and that disk has the entire structure of that disk inside of a single file on the host operating system running the virtual machine. And that's true of various hypervisors such as VirtualBox and Hyper-V and QEMU on Linux and others. So I published a tutorial about a year ago in August of 2022, which was entitled Virtual Disks in Linux, where I explained how you can create a virtual file outside the context of a virtual machine and how you can mount it to the Linux operating system. So virtual disks, which are disks emulated inside of a file, can be created and mounted in both Windows and Ubuntu, and really any Linux for that matter. And so really that's what we're going to look at today. So we're going to learn how to create and mount virtual disk image files in both Windows and Ubuntu and manage them as well. And for compatibility reasons, the disk images are going to have a fat partition table as opposed to a GUID partition table, only because that's just a bit easier. And then they're going to have a primary partition formatted in NTFS. So here we are over in Windows 11, and what I'm going to show you to begin with is going to be a tool called DiskPart. And DiskPart was a replacement for the original DOS disk partitioning tool called fdisk. And that happened right around back in Windows 2000, which was quite a bit of time ago. So just as a little reminder, if we go into this PC, we're going to see here drive C, because this is a very simple system, and I want to start out simply so that we can see things laid out pretty easily. So if I do a right click on this PC, go down to show more options, you'll notice that in Windows 11, at least the later versions of Windows 11, they've kind of buried the manage function down in that show more options. If we click show more options, that will bring up the computer management screen. And for whatever reason, even though we've selected the dark theme, I apologize for the splashing white color. It doesn't seem like the operating system is following that theme for every utility. So we'll go down here into disk management and select it, and here we can see the layout of drive C. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize that for now, because we're going to go off and do some things to see how we can create this disk. So if I right click on the start button and I go launch an admin version of the terminal, and then I respond to user account control with a yes, that will bring up an administrator PowerShell or command. It really doesn't make any difference. And then I go ahead and launch diskpart. In order to create a virtual disk within diskpart, I use the command create vdisk file equals, and then within quotes I have to have the entire absolute path of where the virtual disk file will be located. So in this particular case, since I'm on a profile Scott, it's c:/users/Scott/virtual hd.bhd. Now you can locate this file anywhere, it's just that I'm putting it in that location for simplicity. And then I say maximum equals 50, and that number is the number of megabytes that you want your virtual disk to be. And then finally, type equals fixed, and we also have an option to say type equals expandable. The difference is a fixed type allocates all 50 megabytes at once, and expandable allocates whatever space it needs initially, and it expands as space is used within the virtual disk. So I simply hit enter, and it goes ahead and creates the virtual disk. Now we want to go ahead and select that virtual disk file with the command select vdisk file equals, again, then in quotes, the fully qualified path of the virtual disk image file. Now I want to go ahead and issue an attach vdisk. And now I'm connected to the disk itself. And so my next step is going to be create partition primary, which creates a primary partition. Now that we've created the partition, the next step is going to be to format the partition. So I am saying format space fs for file system equals ntfs, and I'm going to give this file system the label Scott-virt, and I'm going to do a quick format. Now that the disk is formatted, you notice here in this PC, I'm not yet seeing the disk, and that's because we haven't assigned that disk a drive letter. So our final step is going to be to assign it a drive letter, and I'll go ahead and say assign letter equals V for virtual. Once I do that, if I go back to this PC, we have a drive V, and it has the label Scott-virt, and you can see that 37.1 megabytes of 48.9 megabytes are used. If I move into that disk, there are no files in it yet. We're just going to create this device and put a few test files inside of it. Before we do that, if we go back to our disk manager, you'll notice that disk manager has disk 0, which is the operating system disk, and it has multiple partitions on it. And then we have disk 1 down here, and it is a virtual disk that we just defined and mounted, and you can see that it has a primary partition on it. So let's create a couple of test files real quickly. I'll go ahead and do a right click and say new folder, and I'll say Windows -new, and then I'll go ahead and do a right click and say new text document and say from -Windows, and we'll go ahead and edit this document and say this text was entered on the Windows OS. Then I'll go ahead and exit this and say, yes, I want to save this file. I'll move inside of Windows New and say new text document, another text entered from Windows. And we'll go ahead and exit it and say save as well. So there's some more commands that we want to take a look at in disk part, and I'll have these in the show notes. But if we do a list vdisk, that will list virtual disks that we have defined on the system. And you can see that we have vdisk 0, which is disk 1 on the system. And we notice that by going to Disk Manager. Here it says it's disk 1. And it has the asterisk next to it to let us know that it is the currently selected disk when we perform the select command. Next we have the list volume command, and list volume will list all of the partitions on the system. And as you know, volume 0 has drive letter C, volume 1 and 2 are hidden from the operating system. Volume 1, which is a FAT32 formatted partition, is an EFI boot partition. And then volume 2 is our NTFS hidden partition that all Windows systems have. And then volume 3, which is our currently selected volume, is the virtual disk that we just created. Likewise, we can also do a command list disk, and when we list disk, it will list both of the disks, and obviously we have disk 1 as the currently selected disk. So we could do command such as list disk 0 or list disk 1, and we can also do the command list partition. If I can spell here, list partition. And so we have partition 1 on the currently selected disk, and it is a primary partition. Before we can move this disk image file over to Ubuntu, we're going to need to dismount the disk, and we could simply perform the command to detach it from the system. But if you had entered disk part for the first time, after having mounted the disk, you'd want to do a select vdisk file equals and then specify the file. Of course, it is already the selected file, but I'm going to go ahead and hit enter and select it again. Then in order to do that, we do a detach vdisk, and it says that the disk is successfully detached from the virtual file. If we go ahead and launch this PC again, now you notice that we only have a drive C, and drive V appears to be gone. So at this point, I'm done with the disk part tool, but I want to go down here to my C:\users\Scott, and you can see that here is the actual file, and it gives the icon of a virtual hard disk, and it says that the type is a hard disk image file. So it's not currently mounted because we've detached it using disk part, but this is the file that we're going to want to move over to the Ubuntu system. At this point, I'm really done with disk part, so I'll type exit, and then I'll go ahead and type exit to exit out of my command shell or my PowerShell. Now I'm going to go ahead and launch a separate file manager, and I'll go ahead and go to the desktop on it initially, and then I have a folder over here on my NAS which I call virtual disk. and it doesn't have anything in it right now, but I'm going to go ahead and drag that virtual disk over to my NAS just so that I have a place to look at it over there. And back here on the Windows system, I'm going to go ahead and delete this copy of the virtual disk because we're going to modify it on Ubuntu and then move back the modified copy to Windows to look at it. So here I'm deleting it from the Windows side, and you can see it's gone. Over here on my Ubuntu system, in the file manager at the top of the screen, you can see virtualhd.vhd, and that's the file on my NAS. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that from there to a folder on the local Ubuntu system called virtual VHD. And then I'm going to go ahead and delete the file out on the NAS just so I don't get confused. I'm going to launch a terminal over here with Control-Alt-T. Since the NTFS file format is not indigenous to Linux, we have a tool that we call libguestfs-tools, and that package allows us to mount guest operating system file structures. So we're going to do a sudo apt-get install libguestfs-tools. And yes, for those of you that watch the channel, we could do a sudo aptitude install. We can do a sudo apt-get install, which was actually the original command, but it's more commonly abbreviated to sudo apt install. So we install the guest tools, and you can see on my system, I already have it installed, and you may need to install it on your system. In order to make a drive accessible in Unix, we don't assign a drive letter. Instead, we go ahead and create a mount point. And it's usually customary to create that mount point in either a folder called /mount or /mnt, although you can really create it anywhere. And it's just an ordinary folder that we're going to mount our guest file system inside. I'm going to move over to where the virtual disk file is located, which is in a folder on my desktop. So I'm going to cd to desktop/working, and then I'm going to do an ls over here, and there is our virtualhd.vhd file. I'm launching one of the command line tools that's part of that guest file system that we installed. So I'm doing a sudo guestfish --rw-a on virtualhd.vhd. At the prompt, I type run, and then at the next prompt, I'm going to type list-file systems. And then you can see that it says we have an NTFS file system that's on /dev/SDA1, and this will differ on your system, but we needed to know what that value was. Now we're done with the guestfish utility, so we can type exit and hit enter. I want to know what the group ID and the user ID is of my Linux account, so I do a cat of /etc/PASSWD, and I pipe it over to grep and search for Scott, since Scott is the name of the user account I'm logged into, and it comes back and tells me my group ID is 1000 and my user ID is 1000. Now that I have the information that I actually need, I can mount the disk. So I'm going to go ahead and stretch this window out to the side a little bit, and not quite, maybe just a little bit more so we can see the entire command. And we have a sudo guest mount, which is another command line utility from that guest package we installed, --add virtualhd.vhd, which is the name of our disk image file, and then -o, the owner is UID 1000 and GID 1000, and then allows other users to access it as well. And then --RW, which means that our mount point is going to be /MNT/VDisk, which was the mount point that we created earlier. And then -M/dev/SDA1 is what we found from the guest fish. It told us where that disk was. So I hit enter, and that goes ahead and mounts the disk. So I'll go ahead and bring my file manager up here. Let's go ahead and stretch its window out just a little bit. And we remember that these things are mounted in /MNT. So I go over there, and there's our folder called VDisk that we had created, and we had mounted our virtual disk into it. So we click on it, and there we are. We have the Windows-new folder. Inside of it, we have something called another .text. If I go ahead and open that with a gedit command, you can see it says another text entered from Windows. If we go back up one level and we go to the from Windows text, and I do an open with on the text editor over here, it says this text was entered on the Windows OS. So let's go ahead and create another folder, and we'll go ahead and call this folder from, or say, Ubuntu-new. And we'll go inside of it, and we'll say create a new empty document, and we'll call this test.txt. And we'll go ahead and right click it, do an open text editor, and say text entered from Ubuntu. Go ahead and save it out and exit it, and go back up another level, and now go into the Windows, or not the Windows new directory. Let's just go ahead and create another document up here, and we'll just call this from-ubuntu.txt. And we'll go ahead and right click it and say open with text editor, more text entered from Ubuntu, and do a save and exit gedit. So now we have more files that we've added from the Ubuntu side, and now it's time to dismount our virtual disk and move it back to Windows. Dismounting the virtual disk is really easy because all we have to do is a sudo umount /MNT/VDisk, and now the disk is dismounted on the Ubuntu side. We can verify that the disk is dismounted because we can go back up to the /MNT/VDisk folder and refresh that. And when we refresh it, we get nothing back because we're simply looking at the empty folder /MNT/VDisk because nothing is mounted inside of it. So I'm going to go back over here on my NAS and go back to my virtual disk storage folder that I created, which at this point in time there shouldn't be anything in it, and there is not. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring up the working folder that we had been working with, and we'll drag the file back over to the NAS. And now it's over on the NAS. I'm going to go ahead and delete it from the Ubuntu side just so we don't have too many of these floating around. Now it's over in the NAS, and it's time to go back over to the Windows side. Over in the Windows side, I go ahead and bring up the Scott folder. And of course the image is not over here as of yet. And I go ahead and bring up another file manager window. And I'll just bring it up for the desktop initially. And then I'll go ahead and move over to virtual disk on the NAS. Now I'll drag the virtual disk back over to be a local file on the local Windows system. And then I'm going to go ahead and delete the one back on the NAS again so that I don't get it confused with anything else. We'll go ahead and close both of these Windows File Manager windows. Come down here and right click on the Start button and launch ourselves an admin version of terminal, respond to the user account control UAC prompt, and we have our Windows administrator command prompt in PowerShell. Now I go ahead and enter disk part over here. And next, I go ahead and do a select vdisk file equals the same file name to go ahead and select it. And it says that the virtual disk file is successfully connected. And now all we do is an attach vdisk. Now if we go over here and do a right click on this PC and go to show more options and go into manage, and then when this comes up, we'll go ahead and select disk management. We have a drive or a disk 1, and it still remembers the drive letter of V, and somehow I feel like that might be stored as part of the disk. I'm going to close computer management and open this PC, and you can see there is drive V. Let's move inside of drive V, and now you can see that we have a from Ubuntu file which we created on the Ubuntu side, and we also have an Ubuntu new folder, and inside of it we have a text file, and so everything made the trip correctly. Let's go ahead and detach our virtual disk again simply by saying detach vdisk, and now it's successfully detached from the system. We can verify that by going into this PC, and we only have drive C, and drive V is no longer here. Now I'm going to exit this part and exit the PowerShell, and we're going to go to the Scott folder, and we're completely done with this virtual hard drive, so I don't want this file hanging around anymore for our next step. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it, and now that virtual disk is completely gone. We had deleted it over on the NAS, we deleted it on the Ubuntu side, and we deleted it on the Windows side, so there's no trace of it. Somehow or another, I feel a little bit like a magician where I'm saying, okay, so there's nothing up my sleeve at this point. So anyway, we're going to do something a little bit different. On the Ubuntu side, we're going to create an NTFS disk from scratch here. We're going to put some data in it, and then we're going to move it over to Windows. So what we want to do is we want to execute a DD command, which is known as disk duplicator, and sometimes it's also referred to as data destroyer, because if you make the wrong command, you can wipe out a disk very easily. So we're doing a DD if, which is input file, equals /dev/0, which is just a way to push zeros or create blocks on a block-oriented file or disk. And then I'm doing an output file equals /home/Scott/desktop/working, and I'm calling this virtualhd.img. So you notice I'm not calling it .vhd, and the reason for that is because this file is going to be what's referred to as a raw image file, which we'll later have to create a virtual disk file out of. And then the block size is going to be 1 meg, and we're asking for 50 blocks. So we go ahead and create that, and now we have a 50 block file, which is 50 gigabytes. Okay, that would be megabytes and not gigabytes. I get carried away. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to set up a loop device. So in Linux, a loop device is a virtual device, and it's what allows us to take a file like an image file, or another example would be like an ISO file, and mount that file as though it's a real CD or DVD or disk. So we're going to do a sudo lo setup -f capital P -- show, and then give the complete pathway down to our virtual hd.img file. And it comes back and says /dev/loop37, and that's actually telling us what the name of the loop device is, and we're going to want to remember that because we're going to have to use it in all of the following commands. Now we're going to execute the Linux partition manager, which is parted, and on the channel before, I've often executed gparted, which is the GUI version of parted. And so parted would be the equivalent of diskpart over on the Windows operating system. So now I'm entered the parted utility with our /dev/loop37 device. Since this is a new partition, I'm going to do an mk label MS-DOS. So what that does is it creates an MS-DOS partition table as opposed to a GUID partition table, which is actually what we did over on the Windows system as well. The next step we want to do is a mkpart primary ntfs 1, or 1 space -1. What this does is it makes a primary partition, which will be an NTFS partition. It begins at the first sector of the disk, and -1 says use all the way up to the last sector of the disk, whatever that actually is. And then finally, we can quit the parted partition tool manager program. Now I'm going to create a folder for a mount point as /mnt/virtual disk. Now we have to go ahead and format a file system over there, and we do that with sudo mk ntfs -f /dev/loop37 p1, which is partition 1, or that primary partition we created. So now it says that the partition start sector was not specified for loop 37p1 and could not be obtained automatically. It's been automatically set to 0. And it says the amount of sectors per track was not specified and could not be obtained automatically. All this is just an informational message. You don't have to worry about it. It actually did format this virtual disk as an NTFS partition. So now the only thing left to do is to mount the partition into the mount point. We do that with a sudo mount /dev/loop37 p1 over to /mnt/virtual disk. So here we have a file manager up and running, and if I go over to /mnt, we have virtual disk here. Before we used the mount point vdisk, and just so we didn't have any confusion, I went ahead and created this one called virtual disk. So we go inside a virtual disk and we don't see anything here. Let's go ahead and create a folder, and we'll call this from-ubuntu, and we'll move inside that folder, do a right click, create empty document, and we'll call that empty document ubuntu-file.txt. And then we'll right click on it, say open with text editor, and we'll go ahead and say file created from Ubuntu. Go ahead and save that out. And let's go ahead and go back up one level and say a dash file I dash created dot text, and go ahead and do an open with text editor and just say I put this in Ubuntu also, and go ahead and save that and exit gedit. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and close our file manager, and we go back over here to the terminal, and at this point I can do a sudo umount /mnt /virtual disk. After you unmount the disk, it's usually good practice to go ahead and delete the loop device. So we do a sudo lo setup space -d /dev /loop 37, and that goes ahead and removes the loop device from the system, just so we don't have a bunch of virtual devices hanging around. The virtual disk file that we created is an NTFS formatted disk image that we mounted here in Ubuntu. Unfortunately, it's something that we refer to as a raw disk image, and before Windows can use it, we need to format it back as a VHD, or actually convert it to a VHD. In order to do that, we're going to install something called QEMU-utils, and of course QEMU is the virtual disk manager in Linux, and it has a series of tools, and one of the tools is a tool that can convert back and forth between raw disk images and virtual disk images. So I go ahead and install that. Of course, it was already installed previously, so it didn't do anything again. You're probably going to have to install it on your particular system. So we want to go back to CD desktop /working, because that's where our disk file is, I believe. And we do an ls, and there is virtual hd.img. So in order to convert that, we're going to have to do a QEMU-img convert -f, which is the format, convert from a raw image, and then -o vpc virtual hd.img over to virtual hd.vhd, and that goes ahead and converts it. If I do an ls-l for long listing, we'll be able to see the file sizes, and it created the original image is the 50 gigabytes. The newer image appears to be only about or 50 megabytes rather. The new image only appears to be about 10 megabytes, but that's because it really is the larger size. It will expand as soon as we mount it back again in the Windows side. So in the file manager, here's the virtual disk.img, which was the raw file, and here's the virtual hd.vhd, which is the converted file. And down here on the bottom is the folder over on my NAS. So I'm going to drag the virtual hd.vhd file over to the NAS, and there is a copy on that side. Back in the Windows world, I'm going to go ahead and open the Scott file manager location where we want to put the virtual disk, but there isn't one right there at the moment because we haven't moved it yet. And then I'm going to go ahead and launch another file manager down here. And in this one, we're going to go over to virtual disk on the NAS. go ahead and copy that virtual disk back to the local system. And then, just so I don't get confused, I'll go ahead and delete the one off of the NAS. And say, yes, I do want to delete that. Go ahead and close both file manager windows. Okay, so right-click on the Start button. Go ahead and launch an admin version of the terminal. Respond to the UAC prompt. And then type in diskpart to enter the disk partition utility. At that point, we want to go ahead and select the virtual disk with the command select vdisk and specify the file name. Next thing we want to do is do an attach vdisk. Now, this attach command will go ahead and attach it and make it drive D by default, because we had a drive C and we haven't moved this file over before. But I really want to make it drive V, so I'll show you how to do that. What we're going to do is do a list volume, and we can say select volume 3. And if we do a list volume again, we can see there's an asterisk next to volume D, and now I can say assign letter equals V. And if I go back up here to my PC, we now have disk V. If I open disk V, there are the files that were created from the Ubuntu side. And just as a review, we have the From Ubuntu folder. If we go into it and launch the Ubuntu-file, it says file created from Ubuntu, which is what I typed in over on that side. If I go back up one level and then click on the A file I created, it says I put this in Ubuntu also. So those files were correctly created. And just to show you, I can create new files here because we do have read-write access to it as expected. Created in Windows. And we can go ahead and use this just as a normal NTFS disk. And just as a reminder, if we right-click the Start button and we go up to the Disk Management option, you can see that disk 1 is drive V, and it is an NTFS primary partition on our virtual disk that we created. But this virtual disk we created on the Ubuntu side as a raw disk image, and then we went ahead and converted it to a VHD or virtual disk and then mounted it in Windows. And of course, you've seen what happens if we take the virtual disk and move it to the other side and mount it from Ubuntu. So we can go in both directions. I think the management of virtual disks and the management of virtual disks between Linux and Windows is a good skill to have and a good set of tools to understand. And I deliberately looked at the tools from the CLI point of view, because that way you can see all of the steps that are involved to perform these operations. So in summary, we used Windows diskpart to create a virtual disk image, which we formatted in the NTFS file system, and we assigned a drive letter to it so it would be accessible in Windows. We dismounted the disk in the Windows operating system, and we moved it over to Ubuntu, where we mounted the drive using a utility called guest mount. And we also created an NTFS raw image disk using the dd command, and we mounted it with a loop device over in Ubuntu. And then finally, we converted the raw image to a .vhd using QEMU-IMG and successfully moved it to Windows and remounted it. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.